when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking you two are the best people to talk to about sort of this convergence between criminal justice reform and also the business aspect of it. I wanted to start in New York specifically because we are in New York and you both are doing a lot of work here in New York. And specifically look at what the public sector is doing. Governor Kathy Hochul has a lot of initiatives out there. Is that progress? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we talking about this in the right way? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Listen, I mean, just step back for a second, right? I got in criminal justice reform 5 years ago. And at that point, it was a real uphill battle. And there were guys like Brian Stevenson and Robin Steinberg and local advocates all pushing this story that the system was unfair, unjust, racially biased, mean-spirited, and uneconomic. And the good news is that argument won the day. And, with George Floyd especially, you had this shift in momentum where I think everybody said, yeah, we need to fix this. And so that's awesome news, and we shouldn't forget that. Post-George Floyd, a few things happened, right? The progressive side of the movement probably got carried away with things like defund the police, maybe the four worst words that ever happened in criminal justice reform. Prison abolition, good idea, bad vocabulary. And a combination of the far right weaponizing those words and the rise in violent crime in cities. Now, what's interesting is you saw a rise in violent crime in New York City, but you saw it where we had bail reform and criminal justice reform, but you saw it in almost every city in America, depending if they had reform or not. The ideas got, conflated, and that's been a problem. And so since then, right, criminal justice reform has been on its back foot. Governor Hochul has been pretty good at trying to hold the line, but the state legislator, the state Senate, even though it's democratically controlled, is feeling a tremendous amount of pressure to roll back some of these reforms, right? Mayor Adams got elected on saying, I'm going to make the city safe. And so what I think needs to happen and is starting to happen is the criminal justice reform story has to lead with safety first. What's not intuitive, but is fact, is that in places where we do good criminal justice reform, when you do bail reform, cities are actually safer. That feels counterintuitive, but the facts line up. If you take people and you erase their record, right? The Clear Act bill, right? You erase their record, they're far less likely to go back to jail and commit crimes. And so what we're pushing for and what we need is smart criminal justice reform going forward. But right now, we've got to kind of win the narrative back. And the narrative and the politics are pushing back the other direction.
Celia, talk more about what Mike was just speaking about, the Clean Slate bill, which is something that has been floated a lot, which not only is just about sort of your records, but also could tie into the private sector and into the workforce. Can you just expand on that, especially because you talk to businesses all the time? Yeah, so our work is working exclusively in the criminal justice reform space, and all we do is work with businesses, and so much of it is because of what Mike just said. We need businesses to help us kind of clamp down the lid and turn up the heat when it gets harder to achieve change. So what Clean Slate, this is a great example of this, right? So what Clean Slate is it's a piece of legislation that essentially applies technology to the justice system so that people get access to something that they are already entitled to. So here in New York, if you have certain criminal convictions, most of them are misdemeanors falling into the lower end of the spectrum, and a specific period of time has passed and you haven't committed a further crime, you are entitled to have that record sealed. The impact of having that record sealed across the board, where we look at data studies, you are more likely to get an interview for a job by about 50%. You are more likely to get that job, again, by about 50%. And actually, in the states where this has happened, the job that you get is more likely to be better paid. So I feel like in this room, I don't need to explain why that's a good thing. And so what Clean Slate does is essentially it runs a software program through court records so that people who are already entitled to that record sealing process get that record sealing process applied automatically. And if you're sitting here thinking, this sounds shiny, this is a nice thing, do we absolutely need it? Here in New York,
the percentage of people that are entitled to have their records sealed, but who are actually, it'd be fun to see what people guessed would be the percentage. But of the people who are entitled to have their records sealed, 1% are actually getting their records sealed. So when we're thinking about, like, what are those practical things that we can do right now that businesses could be involved in, the time is right now for Clean Slate in New York. Here we are in New York, as you pointed out. God knows, I never know where I am. Living out of a small rollerboard suitcase is the answer to that. But like here in New York, Clean Slate is on the table. The timing for that is April, as we look to get the governor to put it into this budget this year. And the impact would be that, you know, we just did this in Utah, much smaller state, you know, much smaller population. But on the day that that software program was switched on in Utah, upwards of 400,000 people had their records sealed on that day.
Wow. And it's wildly important in that, A, we've got a giant labor shortage.
Yeah.
And we certainly have a labor shortage for lower wage jobs. Right? We've had this great resignation where people say, I don't want to work for $15 an hour. Well, there are plenty of people that want to work. You know, the percentage of people that are released from jail that get a job is tiny. And even when they get jobs, if they have a record, then they have a hard time getting a lease. Mm-hmm. They have a hard time, you know, we hired a bunch of people directly, you know, coming right from prison, and paid them good salaries, you know, $100,000 plus salaries. And even with a $150,000 salary, zero chance of a guy getting a lease unless we have a friend give it to him. Mm. And so the obstacles put in place for people who are coming out of prison, coming out of jail, are immense. Mm. And so things like the Clean Slate Act, especially after they've served their time, and especially for things that don't put the community at any risk, seem to be like essential pieces of legislation to pass.
Can I dwell on that issue of safety for a second? Because I think, you know, often in criminal justice reform, you know, we're talking, it's hard to speak with specificity about the public safety impact of a particular bill, but actually on Clean Slate, because we have 5 or 6 states that have already done this, we're able to look at what the public safety impact is. And actually, when an individual who has a record has that record sealed, 5 years after the sealing process, that person is less likely to offend than somebody who has never committed a criminal offense. So if you are sitting in this room and you have a criminal record and it was expunged, it was sealed more than 5 years ago, I am statistically more likely to commit a criminal conviction than you are at this point.
Yeah. So Mike, I mean, considering the data that Celia just pointed out, you have just mentioned, you know, you are someone who has been willing to hire someone with a criminal record. Are your colleagues, you know, other executives in the industry, are they willing to as well? What are the conversations that you're having at this point in time?
Listen, I think, you know, we originally hired people in Galaxy into our philanthropy, right? One of the things that's been both impressive, I guess, and sad is that people that spend lots of time in prison come out and feel a real need to fight the system. They don't want to leave their brothers and sisters behind in jail that have been subjected to really horrific conditions. And so they have this sense of purpose to fight the system. But it's also been one of the only places people can get good employment, working for Open Society Foundation or this network of criminal justice reform organizations. And so one thing we did this year is we hired a guy named Roddy Johnson. He's one of my favorite employees, 24 years on death row, falsely convicted. And we hired him into Galaxy. And we scaffolded him. We gave him lots of support. He just passed his paralegal exam. He was very proud, and I was proud of him, with flying colors. It won't shock me if he goes to law school soon. But it was interesting. I did that because I wanted to send a message to the other guys that you don't have to just work in criminal justice reform. Like, there's unbelievable talent. Rodney had done a lot of his own defense that got himself off death row for a crime he wasn't, falsely accused of. And so one of the things that I've learned, the 4 or 5 people that work in our philanthropy group that have served long periods of time are brilliant. Like, there's so much wasted talent that's left in jail for often crimes committed when they were 16 or 17 years old or 18 years old, mostly from growing up in the wrong neighborhood, right? And so, you know, I tell the story often of Dwayne Betts. He's the poet laureate at Yale, just won a MacArthur Genius Award. spent 8 years or 9 years in jail, arrested when he was 16 years old or 15 years old for shoplifting. And he used to shoplift. He got caught shoplifting and then carjacking at the same mall I got caught shoplifting at, and Springfield Mall. And when I got caught shoplifting, they called my mother and they cut my fake ID in half and sent me home, and I got worried my dad was going to smack me. He got thrown in jail for 9 years. He was black and came from a worse neighborhood. Listen, he had a gun, I didn't. But he didn't shoot anybody. He didn't harm anybody. He scared somebody. And so this unequal opportunity and unequal punishment that has gone on in our country for long periods of time leaves a tremendous amount of human capital wasting away. And so both on the low end, right, at Bojangles, we initiated fair chance hiring about 3 years ago. We work with the state, we work with the company, and two really amazing things happened. People were nervous as hell. Like the HR department was nervous, they didn't really want to do it. They were really worried that people in the stores wouldn't want to work with someone who'd spent time in jail. And when we told them we were going to hire people that had been formerly incarcerated, they all started weeping and crying. They were like, oh my God, this is our community. I've always wanted to hire those people. I didn't think we were allowed to. And, you know, it's been a very successful program. It went from a pilot program at Bojangles to now it's just part of their normal HR process. The good news is that people stay longer. So if you're in the quick serve restaurant, the fast food business, employee turnover is one of your big costs. And so the employers are staying not a tremendous amount longer, but they're staying longer. So it's a net win for the company. But it's a net win for us as we change our thinking, right? There's 1 in 3 people in America has a family member that's been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. Yep. I think it's 1 in 3. So it's you might not have a cousin or a brother, but if you look at America broadly, it's a huge portion of our population. And so we need to shift how we think of this.
And Celia, you say that companies can get involved even, I mean, Mike was talking about a story from childhood. Companies can take a step and help youth even before they get incarcerated.
Yeah, thank you for asking me about this, because we actually launched last week a new initiative which is specifically focused on young people. So the work that Mike is referring to is often called second chance hiring in our space. It is very, very important, and it is about hiring people that have experienced the criminal justice system and mitigating the damage that they've experienced. But what we proposed was, what if you hire people that have never yet experienced the justice system, but based on research are very, very likely without intervention, without intentional steps, to end up in the justice system. Mike alluded to, you know, a young person who'd been caught for shoplifting, you know, people getting low-level records when they're in their teens. And really the perspective we came from was economic mobility. How much of a barrier to economic mobility is a criminal record? And the answer is profound. So if you really want to achieve diversity within workforces, if you really want to achieve wealth, no matter the color of your skin, then we absolutely must be factoring in the criminal justice system and incarceration as a component of that, and actually trying to take steps to not just mitigate the harm, prevent the harm from happening in the first place. And so based on a research study, we launched a program of intentionally holding a role. This is not an internship, but holding a role for young people falling into 1 of 4 categories. They'd aged out of foster care, they've experienced the juvenile justice system, they've experienced parental incarceration before the age of 18, or they've experienced sex or human trafficking. And what we're trying to do with them is create a relationship between community service providers and the employer to hire for potential for these young people and essentially give them a realistic, viable, very well supported alternative life track to ending up in the justice system and incarceration. And we launched this alongside Walmart last week, and they're our first business supporting us in doing this. And actually, when we talk about like seeing the receipts for those pledges around George Floyd, this is an initiative that is being funded by Walmart.org through their philanthropy arm as part of their commitment to change the future for young people in the US.
Yeah, and it gets companies talking differently, right, about it?
Yeah,
It's changing the
absolutely.
mindset.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, I don't come from business. I always joke about this. Like, I come from the criminal justice reform space. I've spent so much more time in jails than I have spent in boardrooms or in front of cameras. But I think what I've learned about businesses is it's not one size fits all, right? There's some companies that their CEO is going to be an incredible voice for things. There's some companies where the CEO has an allergic reaction if you ask to mic them up and put them on a stage. There's some companies that are going to look very much at the internal of what they're doing. There's some companies that are going to look very much at the external of what they're doing. And what we need to do as criminal justice reform campaigners, and those of us that are trying to disrupt the criminal justice system, is be nimble to that, right? And offer a menu of things and say, we understand that you're not going to order every single thing from this menu, but surely there is something on this list that you could do right now. And I do think that for those companies that are looking at young people in particular that are hiring for potential, we called the project Unlock Potential very, very intentionally in order to talk about hiring for potential. We feel like this could be a fit for some of those companies that perhaps haven't yet got as deep into criminal justice reform as a company like Galaxy and as a leader like Mike.
Mike, what would you advise companies to, if they're listening to this and they're starting to think about it, where do they start?
You know, it's kind of the same answer I give with crypto. Get off zero. People are saying, well, I say, just start.
Get off zero.
And listen, proximity is so important, right? Before I started this journey myself, I would have been shocked to sit around a dinner table with 4 guys that spent over 20 years each in jail. You only spend 20 years in jail if you committed some violent crime that's pretty bad. You were part of a group that murdered someone or was in a gang fight and realized I'd have left my grandkids if I ever had grandkids with these guys, right? Like, people change, they're not their worst moment. And so it's not until you have proximity to people that have gone through this horrific system and come out the other side, at times beautiful people, at times damaged, but trying to, work, that you start having empathy for their path. And so from young kids, getting out and wanting a second chance and be able to mentor people in that experience to people that have, I've got one friend who's 76 who spent 45 years in jail and he's trying to get elders out of jail. It's the most insane thing that we keep anyone over 65 who's not a sociopath. And there's like this many sociopaths in the system, like literally less than a quarter of 1% in prison. The statistics say they don't commit crimes. They've changed. They want to be home. They're good mentors and role models, usually sitting on the stoop even if they don't go back to work, warning kids about the problems. And so we have this system that's just so screwed up. And so what I tell CEOs, what I tell friends is hire 1 or 2 people and see how they change your culture. Like proximity, this is Brian Stevenson's first message that I ever heard. It was like proximity, proximity, proximity. It's the truth.
And the workforce is needed. It's not just moral sense, it's
Yeah,
economic sense.
there's a $57 billion deficit in the amount of money America is not generating in GDP from not putting people formerly incarcerated back to work.
Yeah.
$57 billion, it's not a small amount of money. It's a huge population. Remember, we put 10 million people a year through this system called jail and prison. 10 million people go in the doors, right? And any one night, there's 2.3 million people in there, 500,000 awaiting trial. It's this gigantic machine that just keeps processing out and creating carnage and trauma that everyone needs to start taking note of and figuring, how can I help a little?
Celia, I want to give you the final word.
I'm going to shamelessly ask people to join us in our new campaign on Unlock Potential. We're looking for companies to be part of our pilot program. We're actually asking companies to help us design this program. We want them to have skin in the game from the very start. So, I would absolutely echo what Mike said, which is get off zero, right? Like, if you are a company that's interested in using your government affairs power or your CEO's advocacy, there's a campaign for you. If you're looking at your workforce and wondering how you can be more supportive in your communities, there is a campaign for you. There is a program for you. So I think, Portion of Value, which is a communications agency, recently coined the term JEDI, essentially reflecting that equity, diversity, and inclusion needs to come after justice. If we're not addressing the justice system as part of a nuanced approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're actually kind of missing something. And exactly as Mike said about the scale of it, America leads the world on incarceration. America is conducting essentially a social experiment into how many people in our society on any given day that we can keep in prisons and jails. And I think it's time for businesses to kind of, it's not enough for us to stand on the sideline tutting tutting and shaking our heads. Like there's actually sort of measurable concrete steps that any company could take at any size and scale right now that would begin to dismantle that.
Equity, inclusion, and justice.
Justice, equity,
Justice.
diversity,
Jedi.
included.
Jedi.
It sounds better. The acronym is better
It
than,
does, than what I was
all
just
of the
trying to
work.
do.
No, we got there.
Celia, Mike, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating conversation. We could talk forever. Thank you, everyone.